My name is Karen Langford. I'm 64 years old, a retired school principal, and the widow of James Langford, the man who built the Langford estate with his own hands and heart. For 40 years, this mansion wasn't just a house. It was our story, written in every brick, every tree planted along the driveway. And yet, on the night of my son's wedding, I learned that even stories built on love can be stolen if you let silence speak for too long. Before I tell you what happened, take a moment to follow this channel, because what unfolded that night taught me something I wish someone had told me sooner, that sometimes quiet dignity is louder than any revenge. It was early summer, the kind of evening when the air still carries the last warmth of day. The garden lights shimmered across the marble terrace of the Langford estate. String quartets played soft classical music while waiters drifted through the crowd with glasses of champagne. I stood near the archway, smiling as my son, Evan, and his bride, Lydia, danced for the first time. For a moment, I thought everything had found its rightful place again. But peace, I've learned, often comes right before the storm. I remember Arthur Marston, Lydia's father, standing near the head table. His tie was loose, his face slightly flushed from wine. He was once a man of wealth and reputation, a real estate developer whose company had crumbled decades ago. I'd seen that hunger in his eyes before, the kind that can't stand to see others succeed where he had failed. But that night, I was determined to stay gracious. After all, it was my son's wedding. I told myself I could survive one evening of pretense. When dessert was served, the MC announced that it was time for the father of the bride to give his toast. The lights dimmed, and all eyes turned to Arthur as he rose, glass in hand. His voice filled the room, smooth at first, like a salesman rehearsing an old pitch. He praised his daughter's beauty, Evan's ambition, and then he looked at me. His smile sharpened. "This mansion," he said, his glass catching the chandelier's light, "should have been ours, not hers." The room froze for a heartbeat. Then laughter erupted. Polite, uneasy laughter. Lydia forced a smile, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted her bracelet. Evan chuckled, too softly, as if unsure whether to defend me or join the laughter. I felt my heart drop into a place so cold that even the music couldn't reach it. Everyone thought it was just a joke, the kind people tell when the wine has loosened the tongue. But Arthur's eyes stayed on me, daring me to answer. I didn't. I raised my glass, just enough to acknowledge him, and sipped the champagne that suddenly tasted like salt. For a moment, I looked around the hall, the portraits on the walls, the oak staircase James restored by hand, the chandelier he'd hung himself. Every piece of it had a memory. Yet, in that instant, surrounded by laughter and applause, I felt like a stranger inside my own home. When the applause died down, Arthur sat with a smirk, whispering something into Lydia's ear. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a daughter. It was something else, something rehearsed. Evan leaned toward her, whispering back, eyes darting between us. He looked nervous. I didn't know then, but that unease in his eyes would haunt me later. The rest of the evening passed like a slow burning dream. Music, speeches, clinking glasses, all of it blurred together. I moved through the guests, smiling, thanking, nodding, pretending I hadn't heard what everyone had. But silence has its own way of echoing. Every laugh seemed sharper. Every camera flash felt like a spotlight on my humiliation. After the guests began to leave, I stepped outside to the veranda. The night air was cool, and the gardens shimmered beneath the string lights. I could still hear faint laughter from the hall. I leaned against the railing, looking at the reflection of the mansion's lights on the pond. I remembered when James and I first stood there, years ago, dreaming of a family that would honor what we built. He used to say, "If you ever doubt your worth, just look at what we've made together." That memory, once comforting, now cut like glass. Footsteps echoed behind me. It was Evan. His tie was loose, his expression uncertain. "Mom," he said softly, "please, don't take Dad Marston's joke the wrong way. He didn't mean it." I turned to him. "A joke?" I asked. "Do you think men like him say things they don't mean?" He looked away, ashamed. "It's just, he likes to talk big. He wants to make sure people still see him as important." "And what about you?" I asked. "What do you want people to see?" He didn't answer. He just hugged me lightly, the kind of hug that feels more like an apology than affection. "Try to enjoy tonight, Mom," he whispered. "Please." As he walked back inside, I stayed under the stars, watching the lights fade through the windows. That's when I saw Arthur again, through the glass. He was speaking with one of the estate's staff, Ralph, our longtime house manager. They shook hands. Ralph looked uneasy. Arthur slipped something into his pocket, a small envelope, before clapping him on the shoulder. My stomach tightened. Later, as I prepared to leave the hall, Arthur approached me near the door. He smiled, the same polite smile that now felt poisonous. "Lovely evening, Mrs. Langford," he said. "You've done well with this place, truly. But you know how things change after a wedding. New families, new responsibilities. You might find it easier to let others handle the estate business from now on. You've earned your rest." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Enjoy the night. You deserve peace." Peace. The word felt like a warning. I watched him walk away, joining Lydia and Evan at the stairs. Lydia looked radiant in her gown, clutching Evan's arm, smiling for a photographer who had lingered behind. But her smile flickered when she met my gaze. There was guilt there, brief, almost invisible, but it was enough. I knew then that something beneath the surface had already shifted. When the last car left the driveway, I stood in the doorway alone. The music had stopped, the candles were melting low, and the house was finally quiet. I walked through the empty ballroom, hearing the faint echo of Arthur's words bounce off the marble. This mansion should have been ours. I paused at the foot of the grand staircase, my hand brushing the railing James had carved. The silence pressed against my chest until I whispered to no one, "We'll see about that." That night, as I turned off the final light, I didn't yet know that his words would be the beginning of something far darker, a chain of betrayals that would test every ounce of strength I had left. But I did know one thing: I wouldn't be silent forever. And I didn't have to wait long, because the next evening, at what should have been a peaceful family dinner, the silence broke in a way I would never forget. The morning after the wedding, the house looked almost foreign. The courtyard was scattered with wilted petals, and the echo of laughter still clung to the walls like perfume that wouldn't fade. The mansion had always been a place of celebration, but that morning it felt heavy, as if the air itself had overheard something it shouldn't have. I brewed coffee, letting the familiar scent fill the kitchen, hoping it might wash away the bitterness that had settled inside me. It didn't. By evening, Evan and Lydia invited me to dinner. They said Arthur wanted to discuss family matters before leaving town. I almost declined, but something in me wanted to look that man in the eye again. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was instinct. Either way, I dressed simply and walked into the dining room that night with a calm face and a storm inside my chest. The table was set perfectly, silver gleaming, candles flickering. Ralph moved quietly between us, his posture too careful, his eyes darting whenever Arthur spoke. Lydia sat beside Evan, glowing in her new role as wife. Arthur sat across from me, his expression composed, almost theatrical. I could feel the performance begin before he even opened his mouth. "Karen," he said smoothly, lifting his wineglass. "You must be proud. The wedding was a triumph. Everyone's still talking about how beautiful the estate looked." "It's always been a beautiful place," I replied. "James designed it that way." Arthur smiled faintly. "Ah, yes, James. He had vision. But as I said last night, times change. Estates, families, they evolve. You'll need people who understand the business side of things. Maintenance, taxes, insurance. It's quite the load, isn't it?" Lydia placed her hand gently on his arm, pretending to chide him. "Dad, don't start talking business again. It's dinner." But her eyes flicked to me, gauging my reaction. "I'm sure your father just wants to help," I said, forcing a polite tone. "He's always had an interest in property, hasn't he?" Arthur chuckled. "Interest and experience. My company handled properties 10 times this size in the 80s. Before the crash, of course." His voice dropped slightly. "Funny thing about the market. It rewards the bold. Those who adapt survive. Those who cling to the past fade." Evan shifted uncomfortably, cutting into his steak, though he hadn't taken a bite. "Dad, maybe we can talk about something else." Arthur ignored him. "I was telling Evan earlier that he should consider taking a more active role in managing things around here. He's got Lydia's mind for business. Together, they'd make quite the team. Don't you agree, Karen?" For a moment, no one breathed. The candles hissed quietly, and a fork scraped against a plate. My throat tightened, but I kept my smile. I'm sure my son will do what's best for his family. Arthur raised his glass. "Exactly." Then, as if the universe itself wanted to punctuate his arrogance, a sharp sound cut through the silence, the metallic clang of a knife slipping off a plate and hitting the marble floor. It was loud enough to make everyone flinch. Lydia gasped softly. Evan bent to pick it up, but no one spoke. The sound lingered, vibrating in the air like a warning bell. Ralph froze mid-step, the serving tray trembling slightly in his hands. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, counting the seconds until someone broke the silence. Arthur smirked, breaking it himself. "Ah, accidents happen," he said, as if mocking the tension. "Just like the markets." But it wasn't the kind of accident he meant that chilled me. There was something in the way his eyes lingered on me. A challenge, a threat wrapped in civility. I folded my napkin carefully, set it beside my plate, and met his gaze. "Some accidents," I said quietly, "come from carelessness, others from intent." Evan looked between us. His fork paused midair. "Mom, please," he whispered, but I could tell he was afraid. Not of me, but of the truth he was starting to sense beneath the surface. The meal continued, though no one tasted much. Arthur filled the silence with stories of business, of opportunities missed and wrongs he still meant to right. Lydia nodded, playing the obedient daughter, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Ralph brought out dessert, and for a brief second, our eyes met. He looked nervous, almost guilty, that same unease I'd seen the night before. After dinner, as we stood in the hallway, Arthur extended his hand to me. "A fine evening," he said smoothly. "I'll be in touch soon about those estate papers. It's best to keep things organized for the young couple." My fingers tightened around the edge of my shawl. "Of course," I said. "Organization is important, especially when there's so much to lose." He smiled, misreading my calm as concession. I'm glad we understand each other. When they left, the house grew quiet again. The dining room, once bright with laughter and music, now felt like a stage after the curtain had dropped. I walked back to the table and looked at the knife that had fallen earlier. Ralph had placed it neatly back on the cloth, but a faint smudge of red wine glistened on the blade, catching the candlelight like a signal I couldn't ignore. I turned toward the window. Outside, the reflection of the mansion shimmered in the pond, distorted by the ripples of night wind. For a moment, I saw James there again, standing in the doorway, smiling the way he used to. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only my reflection, older, sharper, determined. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in James's old study, surrounded by his books, the faint smell of cedar and paper filling the air. On the desk lay the family photo we'd taken years ago. Evan, no older than 10, grinning between us. Back then, the house felt indestructible, but now it felt like a chessboard, and every piece was moving except me. In the quiet, I thought of Arthur's words, of the knife, of Ralph's uneasy eyes. Something was happening behind the curtain of politeness, and I could feel it closing in. I reached for the drawer, opened it, and found the old estate documents James had left behind. I turned the pages slowly, tracing the ink of his signature. It was like touching his voice again. That was when I noticed something. A letter addressed to our attorney, unopened, yellowed at the edges. My heart raced as I picked it up. The envelope was dated just a week before James's accident. My fingers trembled, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths demand the right moment. Instead, I whispered into the empty room. If you were here, James, what would you tell me to do? The house creaked softly in response, as if breathing. Outside, a storm was forming. The wind pressed against the windows, and distant thunder rolled across the hills. Somewhere in that sound, I thought I heard the faint echo of Arthur's laughter, sharp and hollow. I knew then that the peace he'd promised me would come at a cost, and by the next day, I would find out just how much that cost really was. The next morning began like any other, except the air carried a weight I couldn't name. The sky hung low and gray over the Langford estate, the kind of weather that presses down on you until even breathing feels deliberate. I dressed early, planning to stop by the community center where I volunteered, just to get out of the house. But something inside me hesitated as I picked up my keys. I glanced toward the study door, James's study, and felt the faintest pull, as if the house itself wanted to keep me there. When I returned that afternoon, the air smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Ralph was sweeping the porch, his movements stiff, avoiding my gaze. Ralph, I said gently, I'll need to get into the office later. Could you leave the key on the hook? He froze for a second too long, then nodded. Of course, Mrs. Langford. But when I went to check the hook, the key was gone. I tried the doorknob out of habit. It didn't budge. The brass lock had been changed, newer, shinier, colder. My pulse kicked. Ralph, I called, walking back toward the hall. Who changed the lock? He stammered. Maintenance came in this morning, ma'am. Said it was authorized. Authorized by who? He looked at the floor. Mr. Evans said it was for safety. New system. Safety. That word again. It had been used too often lately. I felt the walls narrow around me. Thank you, I said quietly, and he stepped aside, relief flooding his face. I didn't want to scare him, but inside, I was already shaking. I walked upstairs to my room, trying to steady my breath. The corridors were too quiet. The ticking of the old clock downstairs echoed up through the stairwell, a reminder of time moving without mercy. On my desk, the unopened letter from James sat where I'd left it the night before. I stared at it for a long time before finally sliding my thumb under the flap. Inside was a single page, written in his familiar slanted hand. If anything ever happens, make sure the deed remains under your name only. Do not trust anyone offering help with management. Arthur's reach is longer than he lets on. The ink had bled slightly with age, but the words hit with perfect clarity. My heart pounded. James must have written this right before his accident. He knew. Somehow, he knew this was coming. Before I could process it, the phone rang, sharp and sudden, slicing through the stillness. It was the bank. "Mrs. Langford," the woman said, "we just wanted to confirm your recent authorization to freeze 2 of your accounts." I gripped the receiver. "Freeze my accounts? I didn't authorize anything." There was a pause. "We received power of attorney documentation signed this morning under the Langford Trust. It was verified through your son's office." My voice dropped. "Through my son's office?" "Yes, ma'am. The documents were filed electronically. You may wish to speak with your family representative." I hung up slowly, the receiver still trembling in my hand. The weight of betrayal settled like lead in my stomach. Power of attorney. That meant Arthur and Evan had already begun the process of taking control. My chest tightened with disbelief, but the cold logic of it was undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. I called Evan immediately. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted. "Mom, hey, can I call you later? Lydia and I—" "What? Did you sign?" I interrupted, my voice calm but unrecognizable. "Sign? What are you talking about?" "The bank called. They said you authorized a trust. Did Arthur convince you this was a good idea?" He sighed, that exasperated sound I'd heard too often since he was a teenager. "Mom, it's not like that. It's just a safeguard. You're getting older. Lydia and I thought—" "Older?" I said quietly. "You mean incapable?" "No, that's not what I said." "Then what did you mean?" He hesitated. "Arthur said this kind of thing happens all the time. He said it would protect you from tax issues, from liability. It's just temporary." I felt something inside me snap, a thin, invisible thread. "Evan," I said, "I am not a liability. I am your mother. And this house, this family, is not Arthur's property to rearrange." He tried to soften his tone. "Please don't overreact. We're just trying to make things easier." "Easier for who?" I asked, but he'd already hung up. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the empty tone that followed. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone in my own home. Rain began to fall outside, light at first, then steady. It tapped against the windows like quiet applause, mocking me. I went downstairs to the study door again, trying the handle one more time, still locked. My eyes fell to the floor, where muddy footprints trailed faintly across the rug. Larger than Ralph's, too heavy to be his. Someone had been in there. I took a breath and went to the kitchen where Ralph was drying dishes. "Who else was here today?" I asked softly. "No one, ma'am," he said quickly. Then, after a pause, "Well, Mr. Marston came by earlier, briefly, said he needed to drop off some documents for Mr. Evan." I stared at him. "Arthur was here?" He nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Only for a few minutes. I wasn't supposed to mention it. He said it was a surprise." A surprise? The rain beat harder against the windows. I walked to the study again, pressing my ear to the door. Nothing. Only the low hum of the air vent and the distant creak of the old house. My fingers traced the new brass lock. It gleamed under the hallway light. Polished, deliberate, final. I turned away and went to my room, forcing myself to think. James's letter still sat on the desk. His warning wasn't just about Arthur's ambition. It was about the system he'd built. Paperwork, manipulation, charm disguised as favor. He had always found a way to twist logic until the truth looked inconvenient. I called Janet, our old family lawyer. Her voice was steady, professional as ever. "Karen, take a deep breath," she said after hearing everything. "Don't confront them directly. I'll look into the filings first thing tomorrow. Do you have access to your documents?" "Not anymore," I said. "They changed the lock." A brief silence. Then, "That's unlawful if you're still the listed owner. But let's confirm that before we react. I'll send my associate to the county office tonight to verify the deed. You stay calm." Calm. The word rang hollow. After the call, I sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in silver lines. Across the garden, I could see the faint glow from the study window, light filtering through the blinds. Someone was inside. My stomach twisted. Ralph had said Arthur left hours ago. So who was in there now? I slipped on my coat and went outside. The rain hit cold and sharp against my skin, soaking through the fabric almost instantly. I moved quietly, my shoes sinking into the wet grass. The study's side window was slightly open, just enough for me to hear the low murmur of voices. Arthur's voice. Confident, calm. "She'll sign it eventually. Guilt always works." Evan's voice followed, tired and uncertain. "I don't like this. She's confused, not stupid." "Confused?" Arthur laughed softly. "You said it yourself. She's sentimental. That's weakness. She'll cave once we control access. You'll see." My hands trembled, rain running down my wrists. I wanted to storm in, to scream at both of them, but instead, I turned away, walking back toward the guest house. My body was shaking with cold, but my mind was clear. I finally understood. They weren't just trying to help. They were taking everything. Back inside, I dried my hands and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled of rain and cedar. I thought of James again. His laugh, his steadiness, the way he'd taught me that real strength never needed to shout. If he were here, he'd tell me not to let anger cloud my judgment. He'd remind me that justice begins quietly, with patience. So I did the only thing that felt right. I opened my notebook and began writing everything down. Every word Arthur had said, every change I'd noticed, every call, every signature, facts, details, times. It wasn't emotion that would save me now. It was evidence. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. I froze. Ralph's voice came softly through the wood. "Mrs. Langford? I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I opened the door. He stood there drenched from the rain, his eyes red. "They told me not to tell you about the locks. I didn't want to, but Mr. Marston said he'd fire me. I have kids, ma'am. I can't lose this job." I touched his shoulder gently. "You did the right thing by telling me now." He swallowed hard. "Please be careful. He's planning something else. Something about transferring the deed. Said it'll all be official by next week." My heart clenched, but I kept my voice steady. "Thank you, Ralph. That's all I needed to know." When he left, I sat in silence again, the sound of rain softening outside. My reflection in the mirror looked older than it had yesterday, but steadier too. Whatever Arthur thought of me, I wasn't the frightened widow he imagined. By the time dawn crept over the hills, I had made up my mind. I packed a small bag, took James's letter, and locked my bedroom door behind me. The mansion could belong to their paperwork for now, but not the truth it carried. As I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, almost new. The sky was breaking open with the faintest trace of morning light. I glanced back once at the house, the place I had built, the place that no longer felt like home. The windows reflected the pale sunrise, cold and distant. I whispered to the quiet yard, "If you want my silence, you'll have to earn it." Then I walked down the gravel path toward the woods, toward the only person I knew would believe me, Emma Holt. By the time I reached Emma Holt's cabin, the morning fog had lifted just enough for the trees to show their shapes. Her guest house stood near the edge of a quiet lake, hidden behind maples and wild ferns. It had always been our refuge, a small wood-paneled space filled with books, the scent of cedar, and the faint hum of a kettle that always seemed to be boiling. I hadn't called ahead. Emma didn't need warning to open her door. When she saw me standing there, damp and breathless, she didn't ask a single question. She just stepped aside, holding the door open, and said, "You look like hell. Sit down. I'll make tea." I laughed softly, though it came out more like a sigh. "That obvious?" She handed me a towel. "It's written all over your face." She poured hot water into a chipped porcelain cup and set it in front of me. "Now tell me what he's done." Arthur Marston. The name alone made my stomach tighten. I told her everything, from the wedding toast to the new locks, from the frozen accounts to the words I'd overheard through the rain. Emma listened in silence, her eyes steady and unblinking. She had been James's accountant for 15 years, the one person who knew the estate's finances almost as well as he did. When I finished, she didn't gasp or curse. She just exhaled and leaned back in her chair. "I warned James once," she said quietly. "Arthur doesn't let go of old debts. He's been waiting for a way back in since the 80s. I frowned. "The 80s? She stood and went to the bookshelf, pulling down a thick binder. 1987, the year Arthur's company collapsed. Langford Developments bought one of his failing projects to keep it from dragging down the entire town's housing market. James took a loss to stabilize the economy. Arthur never forgave him for that. He called it humiliation. I called it mercy." She opened the binder to a faded set of blueprints. "See this? The Maple Creek project. Arthur cut corners with materials, inflated invoices, and when it fell apart, James paid the contractors out of pocket so their families wouldn't go bankrupt. Arthur lost his empire overnight. After that, he swore he'd rebuild, no matter who he had to step over." I traced the brittle paper, remembering the way James had brushed off that old scandal. He'd said Arthur would never be a threat again. But time changes people, and resentment doesn't die. It just learns to smile. Emma poured me another cup of tea. "You said he's already tampering with the estate?" "Yes, the accounts are frozen. The locks changed. He's using Evan as his front." She nodded slowly. "That's how he works. He makes the victim look unstable, unfit, then swoops in under the guise of protection. Classic guardianship fraud. I've seen it before." My throat tightened. "Then I'm not imagining this." "Not for a second." She looked at me with that calm firmness that had steadied me through so many storms. "Karen, you've always been the reasonable one. That's your strength. But this isn't about being polite anymore. This is about survival. You'll need documentation, witnesses, and someone outside Arthur's circle." "Janet's already checking the deed," I said, "but it may take time." "Good. You'll also need to track every transaction Arthur's made since the wedding. There's always a paper trail, and I might still have access to the old ledgers from the Maple Creek deal, proof that Arthur's been manipulating finances for years. Her tone softened. James trusted you for a reason. You can do this. I stared into the steam rising from the cup. I don't know if I have the strength, Emma. You do, she said firmly. But you can't fight like him. You fight smarter. You use the system he depends on against him. He thinks power is paperwork, so give him paperwork he can't undo. Her words hit me like a pulse of light through fog. Quiet justice. Not shouting, not revenge, just order restored. The wind rattled the window, scattering raindrops against the glass. Emma reached over, placing her hand on mine. Do you remember what James used to say whenever things got bad? I smiled faintly. He said, "Don't argue with fire. Build a wall of water." Exactly, she said. Arthur's fire is arrogance. Your water is patience and truth. Let him think he's winning. Let him underestimate you. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something loosen in my chest. Then that's what I'll do. But I'll need to go back. I can't fight from here. Emma nodded. You'll go back when you're ready, not before. You'll need a plan. Start by gathering evidence, the ledgers, the receipts, the staff records, anything that shows he's meddling. And Karen, she paused, her expression softening. Be careful who you trust. If Arthur got to Ralph, he can get to others. I know, I said quietly. But I think Ralph still has a conscience. He warned me last night. That's something, she said, thoughtful. A guilty man can still choose the right side when the truth begins to hurt. We spent the afternoon going through old boxes she'd kept from her years working with James. The papers smelled of dust and ink, each file a fragment of the past. In one folder, she found a set of correspondence, letters between James and Arthur during the final year before the accident. Most were polite, but one stood out. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, almost angry. You cost me everything. Don't think I'll forget. Arthur's signature below it was unmistakable. My hands trembled slightly as I held it. He threatened him. Not directly, Emma said. But the intent is there. Keep that letter safe. It proves motive if you ever need it. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin. The lake outside turned to glass, the reflection of trees stretching into the still water. Emma lit a lamp, its golden light filling the room with warmth. You'll stay here tonight, she said, not as an offer, but a command. I wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at my bones. Just for tonight, I agreed. As I settled into the small guest bed, I could hear the crickets outside and the faint whistle of wind through the trees. My mind drifted back to James's letter, his warning, his steady voice that I could almost still hear. If they ever make you doubt yourself, trust what you see. I closed my eyes. I saw Arthur's smirk, Evan's hesitation, Lydia's uneasy silence. I saw the ledger Emma had mentioned, the one hidden somewhere in that house. Proof. That was what I needed. Not vengeance. Proof. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled with images of light and paper, locks and rain. By dawn, I had decided. I would go back to the estate. I would find the ledger. I would collect every piece of truth he'd buried under his charm. And when the time was right, I'd let his own lies bury him instead. Before leaving, Emma handed me a small brass key. It's to the attic cabinet, she said. James installed a second compartment there. the one no one else knows about. If the ledger still exists, that's where it will be. I held the key tightly, its edges pressing into my palm. "Thank you," I whispered. She smiled, weary but hopeful. "Don't thank me yet. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When this is over and the truth is out, don't let bitterness be your victory. Let peace be." I nodded, though the word peace felt far away. Still, her voice lingered as I stepped outside into the morning air. The fog was gone now. The road ahead was clear, the trees glistening with dew. I could feel the old strength rising in me again, the kind that doesn't shout but endures. The mansion was waiting, so was the truth. I returned to the Langford estate 2 nights later, just after dusk. The drive through the woods was quiet, except for the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the distant call of owls hidden in the dark. I parked a few houses down, leaving the car under a tree heavy with autumn leaves. The air was damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every sound feel sharper. As I walked up the path, the mansion loomed above me, its windows black, except for one faint light in the kitchen. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the small brass key Emma had given me. It was warm from the heat of my palm, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The back door creaked softly when I pushed it open. Inside, the house smelled faintly of polish and lavender, the same scent I'd always used. It was strange, realizing that something could look so unchanged and yet feel entirely different. Every step on the hardwood echoed like an accusation. Ralph wasn't in sight, though I could tell someone had been here recently. The dishes were drying on the rack, and a half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter. I moved through the kitchen and into the hallway, where the portraits of my family lined the walls. James's eyes followed me from his frame above the staircase, calm and steady as always. I whispered under my breath, "I'm here, James. I'm doing what you would have done." The attic stairs groaned as I climbed. At the top, the air was thick with dust and the faint sweetness of old wood. I turned on my small flashlight, sweeping the beam across trunks, boxes, and stacks of furniture draped in white cloth. The place looked like a museum of forgotten moments. Childhood toys, James's old drafting table, boxes labeled with years long past. In the far corner, half hidden behind a wardrobe, I found the cabinet Emma had mentioned. Its handle was tarnished, the lock small and simple. I knelt, took a deep breath, and slid the brass key into place. It turned smoothly, almost too smoothly, and the latch clicked open with a quiet sigh. Inside were ledgers, 4 of them, thick, leather-bound, the kind that smelled of ink and time. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first one. The handwriting wasn't James's. It was Ralph's neat script, the record of monthly transactions for the estate's charitable trust. Donations in, distributions out. It looked ordinary, until it didn't. I flipped a few pages and froze. Several entries had been altered in darker ink. The signatures didn't match. A note in the margin read, "Transferred to Marston Holdings, verified." My throat went dry. Arthur had already been siphoning funds meant for the foundation James created for the town. I turned more pages. Each month, the numbers grew larger, the handwriting sloppier. There were references to invoices that didn't exist and transfers to shell accounts I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened. "Got you," I whispered. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I spun around, the flashlight jerking across the room. A shadow moved near the door. "Mrs. Langford." Ralph's voice came, hesitant. "Ralph," I exhaled, lowering the light. "You nearly scared me." He stepped forward, his face pale. I shouldn't be here. If they see me talking to you, they won't, I said quickly. You knew about this, didn't you? I held up the ledger. You kept these records. He nodded miserably. I did what they told me to do. Mr. Marston said it was just temporary, just moving funds between accounts. He paid me extra, said no harm would come of it. But when the auditors called, he told me to delete the backups. That's when I knew it wasn't temporary. I closed the ledger and looked at him. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He swallowed hard. Because I was scared. I've got 2 kids in college, ma'am. I couldn't risk it. But seeing what he's doing to you, I can't stay quiet anymore. He glanced over his shoulder, lowering his voice. There's more. He's been using your son's signature on authorization forms. Evan doesn't even read them. Arthur says they're just property maintenance agreements, but I've seen the files. He's transferring control piece by piece. When it's done, he'll have full claim over the estate through corporate ownership. My heart pounded. You have copies? He nodded. On a flash drive, hidden in my locker at the maintenance shed. I touched his arm gently. Bring them to me tomorrow, somewhere safe. Don't come here again tonight. If Arthur finds out you've helped me, he gave a faint, fearful nod. I'll meet you at the old chapel near the lake at noon. No one goes there anymore. Good. And Ralph, thank you. He started to leave, but paused at the doorway. Be careful, ma'am. Arthur has people watching. I think even Lydia knows something's wrong, but she won't admit it. Then he slipped away, the attic stairs creaking softly as he disappeared. I stood there, alone with the ledgers and the ghosts of my past. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. I sat down on an old trunk and opened another ledger, scanning the pages by the trembling light. Each number told a story of deceit, hidden checks, missing donations, inflated property costs. Arthur had been bleeding the estate dry, and Evan had become his unwitting accomplice. A gust of wind slipped through the attic vent, stirring the dust. For a moment, I thought I heard James's voice again, the calm murmur of his study lectures about ethics and accountability. He used to say, "Numbers don't lie, Karen. People do." I smiled faintly. You were right, I whispered. As I gathered the ledgers, a faint noise echoed from below. A door slamming. Footsteps, 2 sets, moving through the hall. I turned off the flashlight, my heart thundering. The voices were muffled, but I recognized one instantly. Arthur. Check the office again, he was saying. She might have taken something. She wouldn't come back, Evan replied, but his voice was weak. You said she left town. Arthur's tone sharpened. I said that's what she wants us to think. The old always try to cling to their treasures. Pride is predictable. I crouched behind a stack of boxes, clutching the ledgers to my chest. Their footsteps came closer, then stopped at the base of the attic stairs. Arthur's voice rose, dripping with irritation. Why is this light on? Ralph must have left it. He started up the stairs. My pulse raced so loud I could barely hear. I looked around, desperate. There was nowhere to hide. Then I saw the small crawl space behind the chimney wall, barely large enough. I slipped inside, pulling the curtain of old sheets over the opening just as Arthur reached the top. The flashlight beam swept across the room. Nothing, he muttered. Still a mess up here. If she comes back, we'll know. Evan said quietly, Dad, maybe we should just stop. This is going too far. Stop? Arthur laughed softly. After all this effort, we're securing our future, son. That house was supposed to be mine 30 years ago. Now it will be. Their footsteps receded, the attic door closing behind them. I waited until the sound of their voices faded completely before crawling out. My legs shook as I stood. For a long moment, I just breathed, letting the adrenaline settle. Then I looked down at the ledgers in my arms. Proof. They were proof of everything. When I stepped outside into the cold night, the air hit my face like a promise. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass slick and shining under the moon. I walked back toward the road, my shoes silent on the wet path. Behind me, the mansion stood still, its windows reflecting the faint glow of clouds drifting past. At the gate, I turned back one last time and whispered, "You wanted a legacy, Arthur. You'll get one." The next morning, I met Ralph at the chapel as planned. The building was small and forgotten, its paint peeling, the bell long silent. He was already there, waiting with a small flash drive in his hand. "It's all here," he said. "Every transfer, every forged signature. If anything happens to me, Emma has a copy too." I took it gently. "You've done more than you know." As we stood in the quiet chapel, sunlight streaming through broken stained glass, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for truth, for James, for the years we'd built together, and for the dignity Arthur thought he could buy. And as I drove back toward town, clutching the flash drive in one hand and the ledgers in the other, I knew this was only the beginning. The truth was finally on my side, and it was time to make the world see it. Miles Connor lived in a basement apartment on the east side of town, the kind of place where the walls sweated in the summer and the ceiling pipes hummed like restless ghosts. Once, his name had been in bylines all over the state. Now, his stories were forgotten, buried under the weight of Arthur Marston's influence and the ruin of a career that dared to expose him decades ago. He opened the door halfway when I knocked, a cigarette dangling from his fingers and suspicion in his eyes. "Mrs. Langford," he said, surprised. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here. Last time we spoke, your husband was still alive." I nodded, stepping into the dim light. "James always said you were one of the few who told the truth, even when it cost you." He smiled without humor. "And it did. Arthur saw to that." I set the ledgers and the flash drive on his cluttered table. "Then maybe it's time for you to finish the story." He stared at the items for a long moment, then stubbed out his cigarette and motioned for me to sit. "You'd better start from the beginning." So I did. I told him everything. The toast, the locks, the frozen accounts, the signatures, the late-night conversation through the rain. He didn't interrupt, only nodded occasionally, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're telling me Arthur's back to laundering money through the Langford estate?" "Yes," I said. "Through shell accounts and property trusts. He's using my son as cover. And I have proof." I opened one of the ledgers, flipping to the pages with altered signatures. "Here, every falsified transaction, every missing donation." Ralph confirmed it. He examined the pages carefully, tracing the ink with his finger. Same handwriting style as before. He never changes his patterns, just the people he hides behind. "You investigated him once," I said quietly. "You know how he operates." Miles's eyes darkened. "I do, and I also know how careful he is about silencing anyone who gets too close. You realize what you're asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to do what you used to," I said. "Tell the truth." For a moment, the basement filled with silence except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Then he sighed and opened his laptop. "All right, let's start with dates and transaction codes. If we can cross-reference these with public filings, we can prove a pattern." We spent hours going through the ledgers. The glow of the laptop screen lit his face in cold blue, making the room feel like a war room for ghosts. I read aloud the handwritten entries while he typed, matching every line to the digital footprints Arthur thought he'd erased. At one point, he paused. "You said your son authorized some of these?" "Yes, but he didn't know what he was signing." Miles frowned. "That's useful. It means there's coercion. If you can get him to admit he was pressured, we have grounds for a full legal challenge. The state takes elder financial abuse seriously now, especially when it involves family trusts." The phrase hit me like a blow. Elder financial abuse. The words were so cold, so clinical, yet they described my life perfectly. "Can we prove it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but Arthur's already running countermeasures. Look at this." He turned the screen toward me. A fresh news article had just gone live on a local outlet, Amber Portal News. The headline read, "Concern grows for widow's health as son takes over Langford estate." My breath caught. The article quoted unnamed family sources claiming I'd been showing early cognitive decline and that Evan had stepped in to manage affairs for my own safety. There was even a photo, taken from the wedding, of me standing alone, looking distant, the caption reading, "Widow Langford's health a growing concern." Miles swore under his breath. "They're already discrediting you." I stared at the screen, fury burning through my chest. "He's turning me into the villain of my own story." Miles looked up. "This is what Arthur does. He builds the lie first, so when the truth appears, no one believes it." I sat in silence, my hands trembling. "How do we fight that?" "With facts," he said simply. "An exposure he can't control. He owns half the local media, but not all of it. I still know people, old colleagues out of state, places his reach doesn't extend. If we can package this right, documents, interviews, a timeline, it'll hit before he can bury it." He looked at me, eyes steady. "But we have to move fast. Once he realizes you're not broken by his game, he'll escalate." I nodded, feeling both terrified and strangely alive. "Then let's move." He stood, gathering his notes. "First, we verify the financial trail. Then we talk to your lawyer, Janet, right? To prepare for a legal counter. And if you're serious about going public, you'll need to be ready for every lie he throws at you." "I've lived through worse," I said quietly. He smiled faintly. "You remind me of your husband." I turned toward the ledgers. He'd want this finished. We worked through the night, piecing together a narrative strong enough to stand on its own. By dawn, the basement was littered with notes, receipts, and printouts. The hum of the laptop had become a kind of heartbeat between us. As Miles stretched his stiff shoulders, he said, "I'll call Malcolm, an old contact who writes for a national outlet. He's not afraid of small-town politics. If he takes this, Arthur can't hide behind his PR machine anymore." "Malcolm?" "Reporter out of Portland. Good man. Still believes journalism can change something." The faint hope in his voice made me realize how much this story meant to him too. Not just for me, but for himself. This was his second chance at redemption, and I was handing it to him. He packed up copies of the evidence. "I'll run background checks today, cross-verify corporate filings, but I need you to be careful. If Arthur suspects you're working with anyone, he'll push harder. Maybe even have you declared mentally unfit to manage your estate." I blinked. "He can't." Miles's expression was grim. "He can. He's done it before. That's how he took down a woman named Marion Coyle in '93, declared her unfit, forged medical statements, took her properties through court order. She spent the rest of her life trying to prove her sanity." I gripped the table. "Then we don't give him the chance." "Exactly." By mid-morning, Miles left to meet Malcolm, promising to call by evening. I stayed behind, tidying the papers, my mind spinning through every possibility. When the knock came at the door, I jumped. It wasn't Miles. It was Ralph. He looked pale, exhausted. "Mrs. Langford, they know." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "Arthur found out about the flash drive. He's furious. He said he's filing an injunction against you for trespassing and property theft." I stared at him. "Property theft? Of my own house?" He nodded miserably. "He's saying you took confidential estate documents that belong to the trust. They're trying to build a case that you're unstable." I sank into the nearest chair. "He's not just taking my home. He's taking my name." Ralph shifted uneasily. "I'll keep you updated. But I had to warn you. He's meeting someone at the mayor's office tomorrow morning, maybe to strengthen his case." "Thank you, Ralph," I said softly. "You've done enough for now. Stay safe." When he left, I sat alone, the walls pressing close. The hum of the pipes felt louder, the air heavier, but instead of fear, what I felt most was clarity. He was cornered. Only a guilty man fought this hard to rewrite reality. That evening, Miles called. His voice was tight, but alive with energy. "He's panicking. Malcolm's in. We're running the first story next week. The Langford deception. But we'll hold the murder angle until we verify the diary." "The diary?" I echoed. "Emma mentioned it when I called her. James's old journal. She thinks it might explain what happened before the crash. If it links Arthur or Lydia, it changes everything." I felt my breath catch. "It's still in the house." "Then you need to find it before he does," Miles said. "And be careful. If he knows we're working together, he'll come for both of us." I looked at the ledgers spread across the table, at the faces of the people Arthur had fooled, at the photo of James tucked into my notebook. The fight wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about the truth, and the man who thought he could bury it. "I'll find it," I said. "And when I do, the world will finally see who he really is." Miles was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Because for people like Arthur, exposure is the only punishment they can't buy their way out of." When the call ended, I sat there in the half-dark, listening to the steady drip of water from a leaking pipe. I thought about everything I'd lost. The laughter in the house, the warmth of family dinners, the peace of being unseen. But then I thought about James, about the promise I'd made to him long ago. Protect what we built, no matter what. I smiled faintly. "I'm still protecting it," I whispered. Outside, rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, steady, and relentless. I stood by the small basement window, watching the drops trace down the glass, and realized something that made me breathe easier for the first time in weeks. Arthur's empire had always relied on silence. But silence, once broken, spreads like fire. And now it was burning. It was nearly midnight when Miles's call ended, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The air in his basement office had felt damp, filled with cigarette smoke and quiet urgency. Now, back in my car, the rain against the windshield sounded like static, blurring the world into gray streaks of water and light. Miles had mentioned the diary, James's diary, the one I hadn't seen since the day of the accident. I drove home without turning on the radio. The mansion appeared through the trees like a ghost, tall, dignified, and silent. The gates were closed, the lights in the upper windows glowing faintly through the rain. It looked peaceful, but peace, I'd learned, was often a disguise. Inside, the air was cool and stale. I moved quietly through the hallways, past the portraits, past the empty dining room where Arthur's smug voice still seemed to echo. My shoes left damp prints on the marble floor. I climbed the stairs to James's old study, heart pounding, and paused at the door. The lock had been replaced again. But Ralph's warning whispered through my mind. They're watching everything. I reached under the stair railing, where James had once hidden a spare key inside a hollow spindle. It was still there, untouched. When I turned the lock, the door gave way with a soft click. The room smelled exactly as it had years ago. Leather, tobacco, paper, and the faint trace of his cologne. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, listening to the soft hum of the rain. The desk lamp was still on, casting a small circle of light over the mahogany surface. Papers were stacked neatly, but not by me. Someone had been here. On the corner of the desk sat a small wooden box I didn't recognize. It was carved with an intricate pattern, roses and vines. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside lay something that shouldn't have been there at all, a sapphire necklace. The widow's tears. The sight of it nearly stopped my breath. The deep blue stone gleamed softly under the light, its surface cool and perfect. I hadn't seen it since the day James died. He'd given it to me on our 20th anniversary, calling it a reminder that love, like a jewel, endures pressure. When he died, the necklace vanished from the hospital belongings. They said it must have been misplaced during the chaos. But now it was here, back in my house, in a box that didn't belong to me. My fingers brushed the cool stone. The clasp had been replaced recently. It shone too new. There was no note, no explanation, only the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. I remembered the photo Miles had shown me earlier that week. Lydia at a local gala, wearing a sapphire necklace that looked identical to this one. My blood ran cold. Either this was the original returned, or the replica she'd worn had been made to hide a theft. I reached for the drawer beneath the desk and found what I was truly searching for. James's leather-bound journal, tucked behind a stack of old letters. The edges were worn, the paper yellowed. His handwriting, the slanted, careful script I knew by heart, filled every page. I sat down and began to read. The first entries were ordinary. Notes about meetings, property updates, small frustrations with aging employees. But a few pages later, the tone changed. Arthur stopped by again today. He's desperate. Claims he can repay the old debt if I just sign over part of the South property. I told him no. That honor can't be bought back. He didn't take it well. Lydia came to the office with documents Arthur said I'd requested. I hadn't. She looked uncomfortable. I can't tell if she's being used or if she's part of it. Evan asked if we could invite the Marstons for dinner again. I said maybe, but something about Arthur's eyes unsettles me. He talks too much about what he deserves. As I turned the pages, my chest tightened. I could hear James's voice in the words, measured, careful, but edged with worry. Then I reached the final week before the accident. Car making a strange noise again. Lydia took it for service last week. Arthur said he'd cover the bill. I didn't ask him to. Told Karen to double-check the insurance papers. Something feels wrong. Can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. The last entry was dated 2 days before he died. If anything happens to me, it won't be chance. I need to get this diary to Emma, but Karen worries enough already. The pen had pressed so hard into the page that it tore the paper. I felt my throat close. My hands were shaking. For years, I'd believed the crash was an accident, a slippery road, a late-night drive gone wrong. But now, reading his words, I saw the truth beginning to form, like a photograph developing in the dark. I flipped to the back of the diary, and a folded pharmacy receipt fell out. I picked it up and held it to the light. The date was 1 day before James's accident. The name printed was Lydia Marston. The item purchased, industrial brake cleaner. The room seemed to tilt around me. There it was, the missing piece, the quiet horror hidden under layers of politeness and power. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to steady my breath. A memory I'd buried deep began to rise. I was back in the hospital room, the night James died. Machines beeped steadily beside the bed. His skin was pale, his voice barely a whisper. "If they ever make you doubt yourself," he had said, squeezing my hand weakly, "trust what you see." He'd tried to tell me. Even then, he'd known. A soft noise behind me pulled me back to the present. The floor creaked. I turned, heart pounding. Lydia stood in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. "Looking for something?" she asked. Her voice was calm, too calm. She stepped closer, her heels silent on the rug. I closed the diary slowly. "I could ask you the same." She looked at the necklace on the desk, then back at me. "I came to return that. I didn't think you'd still be awake." "Why now?" "Because I couldn't keep it anymore," she said softly. Every time I looked at it, I felt him staring back at me. "James?" She hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I was helping my father. He said the brakes just needed cleaning, that the car was old and dangerous. I didn't know." Her voice cracked. "I swear I didn't know." The room felt unbearably still. The only sound was the rain against the window and the faint ticking of the clock. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she was just another pawn in Arthur's cruel game. But the image of James's handwriting burned in my mind. If anything happens to me, it won't be chance. "Lydia," I said quietly, "you need to tell the truth. All of it. For once in your life, do something right." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You think that'll change anything? He'll destroy me." I rose, my voice calm but firm. "He already has. But maybe it's not too late to stop him from doing it to everyone else." She took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't. You don't know what he's capable of." "I do," I said. "And that's why he's going to fall." She turned and fled down the hall, her footsteps fading into silence. I stood there for a moment, clutching the diary. The rain outside had softened into a whisper, but my pulse still thundered. Lydia's confession was the missing piece Miles needed. And the necklace, the proof of guilt hidden in plain sight, would make sure Arthur couldn't twist the story this time. I placed the diary and necklace in a small leather bag, locking it. Then I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. The house felt alive again, its walls holding their breath. I could almost hear James's voice beside me. "Now they'll see." The next morning, I met Emma and Miles at her cabin. Miles looked exhausted but alert, his laptop open, papers spread across the table. "You found it?" he asked. I handed him the bag. "The diary, and this." I showed him the necklace. She returned it herself. He examined the diary carefully, his face hardening with every page. "This changes everything. With the brake cleaner receipt and the timeline, we can link Arthur to negligence. Maybe worse." Emma sat quietly, hands folded. "Are you sure about going public, Karen? Once this comes out, there's no going back." "I've lived in silence long enough," I said. "It's time for people to hear what really happened." Miles nodded. "Then we make it count. We'll plan it around Arthur's gala next week, the one he's throwing to restore his legacy. We'll have the press, the documents, the audio recordings ready. When he tries to boast, You'll be there to end the story he started." Emma looked at me, her eyes gentle but firm. "This will hurt, Karen. Not just him. Everyone connected to him. Even Evan." I swallowed. "I know, but my son needs to see the truth too." For a moment, none of us spoke. The lake outside shimmered under the pale morning light, calm and endless. It reminded me of something James once said: "Water remembers everything." That evening, as I sat alone by the window, I listened to the sound of the tape recorder I'd found among James's things. His voice came through faint and crackling. "If they ever make you doubt yourself, trust what you see. The truth doesn't need permission to exist." I closed my eyes and let the words settle deep inside me. Tomorrow, I would return to the estate, not as a victim, but as the keeper of truth. For years, Arthur had hidden behind wealth and charm. He'd made everyone laugh, made them trust him, made them forget. But I hadn't forgotten. I couldn't. The necklace lay on the table beside me, gleaming softly in the fading light. The diary rested open to the last page, the ink still dark where James's hand had pressed too hard. Together, they told the story he never got to finish, and I would be the one to finish it for him. The Langford estate hadn't hosted a gala in years, not since James passed. But now it was dressed again for spectacle. Gold lights spilling through the tall windows, white banners draped across the gates, and the polished hum of violins echoing through the marble halls. The Founders' Gala, they called it. Arthur's grand event to celebrate philanthropy and progress. It was the kind of night designed to make people forget everything ugly beneath the glitter. I stood across the street at first, half hidden beneath the shadows of an elm. The house glowed against the dark sky, magnificent and hollow at once. My reflection flickered faintly in a puddle at my feet. A black coat, gray hair pinned back neatly, eyes colder than I remembered. The same house that had once sheltered every dream I'd ever had now stood as the stage for its reckoning. Emma's car pulled up beside me. She lowered the window and gave me a small, knowing smile. "You ready?" "As I'll ever be," I said. My voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes after too much loss to fear anything more. Miles was in the back seat, adjusting his tie. "Malcolm's already inside," he said. "He's posing as press coverage for the charity section. The DA's liaison is there too, seated near the mayor. Once you start speaking, she'll signal her team." I nodded. "And Evan?" "Confirmed on the guest list," Miles replied. "Lydia too. They're sitting with Arthur." A strange mixture of grief and anticipation twisted in my chest. Evan hadn't spoken to me in over a week. He'd chosen silence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps guilt. But tonight, I intended to free him from both. We parked at the side entrance. The valet, mistaking me for another donor, opened my door with a polite smile. "Welcome, Mrs." He stopped, recognizing my face from years of estate functions. "Mrs. Langford, I didn't know you were attending tonight." "Neither does anyone else," I said softly, and stepped inside. The air was perfumed with lilies and champagne. Guests mingled beneath the chandelier, laughter bubbling like crystal glass. The string quartet played something elegant and hollow. My heels clicked softly on the marble as I walked toward the main hall. Conversation stilled for just a breath when people noticed me. The widow, the ghost of the house. Arthur stood near the podium, surrounded by admirers. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his tuxedo immaculate, his confidence unshaken. He saw me then. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe annoyance, but it was gone before I could name it. He raised his glass and smiled. Mrs. Langford, what an unexpected pleasure. I smiled back, every muscle in my face perfectly calm. Arthur, I wouldn't miss your evening of benevolence for the world. He laughed, but there was tension in it. I'm glad you're here. Perhaps it's time we put old misunderstandings behind us. Perhaps, I said, letting the word linger. Lydia stood a few feet away, pale and quiet, her eyes downcast. Evan sat beside her, his jaw tight. When our eyes met, he looked away. I felt the ache of it, but I didn't let it show. This wasn't the night for heartbreak. It was for truth. Arthur tapped his glass, drawing the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth, practiced. Thank you for joining us tonight as we honor the spirit of legacy and renewal. The Langford estate has always been a symbol of community and endurance, and I'm proud to continue that mission. Applause rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Malcolm, near the back, lifted his phone discreetly to begin recording. Miles gave me a small nod from across the room. Arthur continued, gesturing toward a screen behind him that displayed the foundation's new logo, his logo. Together, we'll ensure that the Langford name stands for progress and generosity. The new Langford Marston Foundation will... I stepped forward then, my voice cutting clean through his speech. You mean your foundation, Arthur? The room fell silent. Heads turned. Arthur blinked, his practiced smile faltering. Karen, he said lightly, perhaps this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, I said, walking toward the stage. The soft sound of my heels echoed in the hush. You've had your turn to rewrite history. Now it's my turn to correct it. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras tilted. Lydia's hands trembled in her lap. Arthur laughed softly, the sound brittle. I'm not sure what you think you're implying. I'm not implying anything, I said. I'm proving it. Miles signaled Malcolm. The lights dimmed slightly, and the screen behind Arthur flickered. Instead of the foundation logo, pages from the ledgers began to appear. Transactions, signatures, transfers, each one stamped with his company's name. The audience gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. Arthur turned toward the screen, his face tightening. This is nonsense. Fabrications. Then perhaps you'll recognize your own handwriting, I said. Or maybe your daughter's receipt. I stepped closer, holding up a photocopy of the brake cleaner purchase. Dated the day before my husband's death, paid in full by Lydia Marston. The room was utterly still. Lydia covered her mouth, tears streaming silently. Evan rose halfway, his voice breaking. Mom! Arthur's face flushed deep red. Enough! He shouted, his composure slipping. This is defamation. You think you can walk in here and destroy my reputation with fairy tales? Not fairy tales, I said softly. Records, statements, and witnesses. I gestured toward the corner where the DA's liaison stood, badge now visible. And the law. Arthur froze. The woman stepped forward. Arthur Marston, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Please remain where you are. The color drained from his face. You can't be serious, he hissed. Miles's voice rose from the back, calm but firm. We have copies of every ledger, every falsified transfer, every bank statement. You used the Langford Trust to funnel funds into your private accounts, and you used deception to gain control over property that was never yours. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Phones recorded every word. Flashbulbs burst like lightning. Arthur's gaze darted toward Evan, desperate. You told her, didn't you? You betrayed me. Evan shook his head, voice trembling. You betrayed yourself. Arthur lunged forward, but the officers moved faster, catching his arms before he reached me. For a moment, he struggled, his voice sharp with rage. You'll regret this, Karen. You think this changes anything? They'll forget you tomorrow. I stepped closer, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the microphone. Maybe they will, but you won't. You'll remember this house, this night, and every lie you built inside it. He stopped fighting then, his breath ragged, eyes burning with something between hatred and disbelief. They led him away through the crowd as cameras followed, and I stood there watching until the doors closed behind him. Lydia sobbed quietly at the table. Evan moved to comfort her, but she shook her head. No, she whispered. She deserves to hear it. Lydia turned to me, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't understand what he was doing until it was too late. I thought I could make him proud. I nodded slowly. You can't build pride on someone else's grave. Her shoulders shook as she wept. Miles joined me on stage, placing a hand lightly on my arm. It's done, he said quietly. You've got your truth. I looked around the room, the marble floors, the glittering chandeliers, the crowd still whispering in disbelief. For years, this house had been my prison of silence. Tonight, it became my witness. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the tall windows, I could see the garden glistening under the soft glow of the lights. The same pond where I once stood after the wedding now reflected something new. Stillness, not pain. Evan approached me hesitantly. Mom, he began, voice thick with shame. I didn't know how deep it went. I should have listened sooner. I looked at him, the same boy who used to chase fireflies in these gardens, the same young man who'd lost his way trying to please the wrong father. It's not too late to do the right thing, I said. It never is. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I'll testify. I'll make it right. I placed my hand on his cheek, the gesture small but enough to break the distance between us. That's all I ever needed. Around us, the guests began to disperse, the buzz of conversation fading into the sound of the quartet, starting a new, quieter piece. The estate no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like exhale. Miles and Emma stood near the door, watching me. Emma smiled, her eyes glistening. He finally got what was coming, she said softly. Not revenge, I said, just balance. As the last of the guests left, I walked through the ballroom one final time. The marble gleamed beneath the soft lights. The air felt lighter. I paused at the spot where Arthur had made his cruel toast at the wedding months before, where laughter had once drowned my humiliation. I could almost hear his voice again. This mansion should have been ours. I smiled faintly. It never was. Outside, the night air was cool and gentle. The sound of cameras and sirens faded into the distance. I stood at the edge of the steps, breathing in the quiet. The estate behind me no longer felt like a house filled with memories of loss. It felt like a chapter closing. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of silence. It had been my weapon, my witness, my shield. Emma joined me, slipping her arm through mine. Ready to go home? I looked up at the stars peeking through the clouds. I already am. We walked toward her car together, the gravel crunching softly under our feet. Behind us, the Langford estate stood in perfect stillness, its lights flickering like the last embers of a long, bitter fire finally burning itself out. And as we drove away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some houses hold pain until someone teaches them peace. Tonight, I had. The room held its breath as the officers moved through the gala, cataloging evidence and taking statements. What had begun as a night of celebration had turned into a public accounting. Cameras clicked and reporters whispered, but beneath the noise was the steady work of law and order piecing together years of hidden transactions. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, James's diary clutched in my hand, and felt the weight of every word he had written settle like a stone in my chest. Evan approached, his face hollowed by weeks of sleeplessness. He had decided to stand with the truth. He had read the ledger entries, listened to Miles, and finally admitted what he had signed and why he had stayed silent. He did not try to soften his role. He spoke plainly about the dinners, where plans were made, and the nights when his father's charm masked coercion. His voice shook only once, when he said, "Mom, I am sorry," and the room felt the honesty in that apology. Lydia sat with her hands folded, eyes rimmed with red. When she stood to speak, the hush deepened. Her confession was not theatrical. It was small and precise, like a hand turning a key. She described the brake cleaner purchase and how Arthur had instructed her to leave receipts where he could find them. She described how she had thought she was doing a practical, harmless thing, and how the consequence of that action had become a wound none of us expected. Her words landed hard. Some people in the room turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, as if to catch every syllable. The DA asked follow-up questions, and Lydia answered with the detail only someone involved could provide. She did not try to evade responsibility. Instead, she offered the awkward truth, that fear and loyalty can twist judgment until good intentions look like betrayal. Ralph stepped forward next. The long-serving houseman had been nervous for weeks. He had admitted to me in a chapel the day before that he had been paid and threatened. Now, before everyone, he recounted the envelopes, the whispered instructions, the times he had been told to ignore old receipts and to mark ledgers differently. His voice gained strength with each admission. When he finished, the ledger pages felt less like lonely artifacts and more like a map that led straight to the source of corruption. Arthur's face was pale when the evidence stack was set before him. He had tried to maintain his composure, but now the lines of control he had assumed were unraveling. He demanded proof, called for discrediting voices, and tried to rally a few supporters with frantic charm. It did not work. The law moves slowly sometimes, but when documents and witnesses align, momentum becomes nearly unstoppable. The officers took a careful approach. They documented Lydia's receipt, photographed the necklace I had produced, and recorded statements from Emma and Miles. The diary pages were read aloud in fragments with permission, the voice on the tape that James left playing softly in the background like a reminder of why this had to be done. People watched, and the truth stitched itself together in public air. At one point, Arthur lunged forward, voice raw with threatened fury. "This is fabrication," he barked. "You will regret this public spectacle." But his words stuttered against evidence. The DA responded with legal calm. "We will investigate fully," she said. "If there is fraud, we will prosecute." Officers stepped in and guided Arthur toward a waiting vehicle. His protests followed him out into the night, but the sound of them began to thin as the cameras continued their steady capture. After Arthur was removed, the room felt unmoored. The guests moved in clusters, murmuring and processing what had happened under the crystal chandeliers. Some looked at me with new understanding, some with astonishment, and others with a kind of shame that comes when you realize you were part of a story and didn't see its darker margins. Evan remained, though. He came to me and reached for my hand. "I should have listened," he said in a voice stripped of artifice. "I should have seen it earlier." He was raw with regret, but also resolute. "I will fix it, whatever it takes." I listened and felt the relief that comes from honesty offered without defense. We had been fractured by greed and fear, but there was a path back if those involved chose it. The confession was not a clean ending. It was an opening, a place where accountability began and where repair could start. Outside, the night was damp. Reporters filed their pieces and Miles's article circulated, attaching Arthur's name to words like fraud and embezzlement. In the following days, the legal machinery moved with deliberate care. Investigators followed the money trail documented in the ledgers, matched signatures, and traced transfers through shell companies. The town watched as papers were filed and as search warrants were executed. Lydia entered an agreement to cooperate in exchange for treatment and reduced charges. Her path forward would be difficult, but it would be one that included responsibility and, hopefully, understanding and healing. Evan testified before a grand jury and did so with the humility of a man who had learned the cost of complacency. He acknowledged his errors and walked through how he had been influenced by the prospect of seeming capable in front of his in-laws and the community. The judge's bench took note, and the prosecutors used his testimony to build a fuller case against Arthur and his network. At the same time, neighbors began to gather and remember. Emma organized town meetings to support families affected by Arthur's projects. Private pain spilled into public conversation. We worked with Janet to secure the estate legally. She moved quietly and expertly, filing motions and ensuring that the Langford deed and charitable trust were shielded from further exploitation. She helped set up temporary protective measures so the foundation James had envisioned could begin to take shape. It was careful, patient work, paperwork used as armor against predatory intent. The judge later sentenced Arthur to several years and ordered restitution. The ruling signaled that wealth did not grant immunity. For affected families, it felt like overdue recognition. Lydia entered treatment and counseling. Her path was not exempt from consequence, but it included an opportunity for rehabilitation and responsibility. She met with families, offered apologies where she could, and began to write a small ledger of her own. Notes of things she needed to repair and people she needed to ask forgiveness of. Ralph found the courage to start anew. With local support, he secured steady work and began to repair relationships he had strained through silence. I saw him months later in the garden, less bent, his shoulders easing as the weight of fear began to lift. He waved at me, and I waved back. Simple gestures that meant more than words. The town shifted too. Conversations in grocery stores and on porches reflected a new caution, but also a renewed sense of communal responsibility. People began volunteering again for causes the Langford Foundation would support. What was broken started to be rebuilt, not only in structures but in trust. One evening, after the hard weeks had softened a touch, I sat in James's study and listened to a tape I had found among his things. His voice crackled warm through the speakers. "If they ever make you doubt yourself, trust what you see. Truth survives." I pressed my palm to the recorder, feeling like I was touching a living memory. When the legal dust had settled enough for clarity, Janet helped me transfer the deed into a protective foundation format that could not be easily seized. We created the Langford Foundation to honor James's wishes to support local families and preserve the estate as a place of community. The documents were precise and binding, crafted to prevent predatory takeovers in the future. At the sentencing hearing, people filled the gallery, some to bear witness, others to find closure. The judge spoke of accountability and the responsibility of wealth. When the gavel fell, it felt less like an ending and more like a turning, a legal pivot that allowed for repair. I left the courthouse with Emma beside me and felt the city air fill my lungs the way fresh water fills a dry well. The repairs were not only legal. There were dinners with neighbors where apologies were exchanged and stories were told. Evan worked to repay some of the funds involved and spent long afternoons at the foundation office, learning how to manage with transparency and humility. He visited Lydia at times, though their future remained uncertain. She wrote letters to families who had suffered in earlier projects, letters that began with apologies and ended with commitments to help when she could. There were quieter moments, too. I walked through the garden at dawn and looked at the roses James had planted. Each petal seemed to tell a story of resilience. I placed a hand against the trunk of an old oak tree and felt time press through my palm. The house had been wounded, but it was healing under the steady care of neighbors and friends. One night, months after the initial revelations, a local reporter asked to interview me about what had happened. I sat in the study with the diary closed on my lap and spoke about truth and the slow work of repairing trust. I told the journalist that forgiveness was not forgetting, but was an act of courageous surrender. We don't get to choose all the harms that come to us, I said, but we get to choose how we respond. The confession and collapse had been brutal, messy, and necessary. It demanded reckoning from those who had built falsehoods and required courage from those who admitted their faults. The town would bear the memory of those weeks for years, and some scars would remain. But the ledger had been exposed. Names had been read, and people had stepped into accountability. As I stood in the study one evening and looked at James's handwriting in the margins of his old notebook, I felt a gentle settling in my chest. The house had not returned to what it had been before his death. It had changed. The past would always be part of it, and so would the choices of the people who lived through the storm. But there was a new steadiness now, a foundation built not on illusion, but on honesty, however uncomfortable that honesty might be. I allowed myself a small moment of grace, a slow breath that felt like a promise, and I thought about the work ahead, with steady and careful hope always. 6 months later, the Langford estate no longer felt like a battlefield. The scent of new paint mingled with the faint sweetness of lilies that Emma insisted on planting along the main path. The once polished marble floors were softened by sunlight again. The air was lighter, quieter, free of whispers and hidden motives. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home, though not the same kind it used to be. It had learned to breathe differently. Outside, volunteers from the new Langford Foundation worked to restore the old stables into a children's reading center. I could hear the sound of hammers in rhythm, the kind of noise that carried promise instead of threat. Inside, Janet stood by the library window, reviewing paperwork on the foundation's latest project, scholarships for local students whose families had once worked for Arthur's developments. The board approved the transfer, she said, smiling faintly. Everything's official now. The deed is secure under the foundation charter. No one can touch it. I exhaled slowly. That's how it should be. It belongs to something larger than any of us now. Emma entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea, the same brand James used to bring home from town. She set one beside me. You know, for someone who never wanted to run a foundation, you've done a fine job leading one. I don't feel like I'm leading, I said softly. I feel like I'm caretaking. There's a difference. She smiled. Maybe that's why it's working. On the mantel, framed photos replaced the cold portraits of wealth that once lined these walls. Children reading under oak trees, local families celebrating small milestones, neighbors laughing at a picnic. Not the legacy of grandeur Arthur had imagined, but the kind of quiet good James would have believed in. A knock came at the door. I looked up, half expecting a delivery, but it was Evan. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, his hands empty, his expression both hopeful and uncertain. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded, and he stepped into the room as if crossing a fragile bridge. Emma and Janet exchanged a glance and quietly excused themselves, leaving us alone. He took a seat across from me. "It looks different," he said, looking around the room. "So do you," I replied gently. He gave a small laugh. "I've been volunteering at the foundation office in town. The board's been patient with me." "I know," I said. "They told me you're good with the budgets. You've learned to balance more than numbers." He lowered his eyes. "I'm trying." Then he added, almost in a whisper, "I can't change what I let happen, but I can change what comes next." For a moment, the sound of the hammers outside filled the silence between us. Then he said, "I found something of Dad's in the attic last week. Thought you'd want it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cassette tape. My breath caught. It was the same type James had used for dictating notes, labeled in his neat handwriting. Langford Reflections. Evan set it gently on the table between us. "It still plays." I checked. I picked it up, tracing the faded ink with my thumb. "Thank you," I said softly. He hesitated. "Do you want me to stay while you listen?" I nodded, and he moved closer as I slipped the tape into the old recorder. The click of the button sounded louder than I remembered. Then came the familiar hiss of static, followed by James's voice, steady, calm, filled with that unshakable kindness I'd almost forgotten. "If they ever make you doubt yourself, trust what you see. If they ever make you feel small, remember who you were before they told you otherwise. The estate isn't just land and walls. It's the people who build it, who believe in it. If it's ever threatened, protect what remains. But never with anger. Protect it with truth." His voice paused for a moment, then softened. "And if you're hearing this, Karen, it means you did. I always knew you would." The tape clicked off. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I exhaled. The words weren't grand or dramatic. They were simple, and they were enough. Evan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "He sounds just like I remember." "He always believed we'd find our way back," I said, "even when we didn't know we were lost." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled faintly. "You're my son." Giving up was never an option. Outside, the hammering had stopped, replaced by the laughter of children exploring the new library wing. Through the open window, the sound floated in, light and full of life. Evan stood. "There's one more thing I wanted to tell you," he said. "The mayor offered me a position helping with community development. They said they want someone who understands what happens when power goes unchecked." I said yes. I looked at him, pride warming the ache that had lived in my chest for so long. "Then your father would be proud too." He nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "I'll come by next week. Maybe help finish the garden." "I'd like that," I said. After he left, I sat in the quiet room, the cassette still on the table, sunlight falling across it like a blessing. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It hummed softly, alive again. Later that evening, I walked down to the lake behind the estate. The water was still, a perfect mirror for the golden sky. I carried with me an old key, the last of the ones Arthur had once tried to use to lock me out of my own home. I held it for a moment, feeling the cool metal against my palm, then opened my hand and let it fall. It sank slowly, leaving only ripples that widened and disappeared. As the sun slipped behind the trees, the estate glowed faintly in the distance. I thought about everything it had witnessed: the betrayal, the loss, the justice, the healing, and through all of it, the quiet truth remained. Silence, when used rightly, can rebuild what noise has destroyed. Emma joined me after a while, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, handing me one. "Some things never change," I replied, smiling. We watched the water together, the surface calm, the sky reflected in it. After a long pause, she said, "It's done now, isn't it?" "Almost," I said. "The rest will take time, but time's what we've been given." She nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "James would have liked this. You didn't burn it all down. You turned it into something that can grow again." I looked at the reflection of the clouds drifting across the lake. That's what forgiveness is, I think. Letting things grow again. A soft wind passed, carrying the scent of lilies from the garden. For a moment, the world was silent except for the gentle rhythm of the water against the shore. I thought of everything that had brought me here: the humiliation, the courage, the faith that truth would eventually find its way through. When I stood to leave, the house lights had come on in the distance, golden against the twilight. I felt James there somehow, not as memory but as presence, the steady voice that had guided me even when I thought I was alone. As Emma and I walked back along the path, she said quietly, "You know, you could write a book about this someday." I smiled. Maybe I already have, just not with paper. At the door, I paused and looked back once more at the lake, the ripples now gone, the surface perfectly still. "It's never too late," I whispered, to James, to myself, to anyone who might need to hear it. And in the stillness that followed, it felt true.